And before I turn over the gavel to Andy, I want to acknowledge this terrific staff we have. We have Susan Jeffries is the office manager. I think they're still out in front. Nikki Clark, communications coordinator. I mentioned Nikki earlier on the annual report. Wade Fickler is our research director. And our very, very outstanding Nancy Hedin, if you would please come forward. Nancy has been the director with City Club for 13 years and has brought us from the dark ages maybe into such enlightenment. We're very thankful to have this wonderful association with Nancy, and we have a gift for her and the award of the Board of Governors Award to Nancy Hedin.
Thank you all for 13 of the best years of my life.
Andy Linehan.
Thank you, Susan. Your leadership has allowed the club to weather some challenging times over the last year and has really set the stage for an excellent year to come. So I'd like to present you with this plaque.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I moved to Portland from the East Coast in the mid-'70s, part of why Portland was such an attractive place to come to was its open and inclusive civic culture. Portland is the kind of place where people feel they can make a difference in the community and where leadership in the public realm is at least as much recognized as the conventional measures of success. More than any other organization, the City Club embodies the commitment to the community and the public realm. As Oregon Senate President Peter Courtney said just a few weeks back in his talk here, City Club is sterling. This is as good as it gets. So it's hard to imagine Portland without a City Club. But you as members, and as the community as a whole, need to realize that the City Club is in real danger now. Danger that is more acute than in any recent time in the club's history. Let me spend just a few minutes to talk with you about the club's current state and what we as club members are doing about that. For a number of years, City Club administrative costs have been greater than revenue from memberships, programs, contributions, and other sources. Contributions to the annual fund drive have been stagnant, and this year we fell $12,000 short of our $100,000 goal for that. Astonishingly, only about a third of City Club members give in the annual fund drive, a number that is really shamefully low, and it really makes it difficult to attract foundation funding. In past years, the City Club was able to draw on investment funds, an investment account fund, to cover a portion of the revenue shortfall. Of course, the fall in stock market values over the last couple of years has reduced the club's endowment value by more than half, as it has wreaked havoc in everybody's stock portfolios. So we're no longer able to draw on that source of funding as a backup. Over the last few years, under Nancy Hedin's able management, the club has instituted a number of austerity measures and personnel cuts, and the club is now operating with what's really a bare-bones staff and with all non-essential costs gone from the budget. We are faced with few choices, and the financial future of the club is at risk. This picture sounds grim, and yet it's all too familiar. Most Oregon nonprofits are facing similar circumstances. However, there are positive signs here at the club, and I wanted to tell you about those and the actions that your Board of Governors is taking to get us moving forward on a more positive step. Despite the fact that we are losing our wonderful executive director of 13 years, Nancy Hedin, we have found a new executive director, Wendy Rodmacher-Willis, who promises to be a dynamo of energy and innovation. She's going to be terrific. And after several years of slow decline in our membership numbers, during the last 2 years, membership numbers have risen slightly, in large part due to the success of our new Leaders program in attracting younger members. The Board of Governors has implemented a budget for the next year that will continue to wean the City Club away from relying on the shrinking endowment fund. One element of that budget is an increase of $15 in the annual membership fee, something that was difficult to do, but we felt we really had to this year. Board members have made a personal commitment to significantly increasing the amount of money they donate to the club or that they raise themselves to supplement the annual fund drive. The new board's first task this summer will be to flesh out and implement a multi-pronged fundraising campaign that will help assure that the City Club remains a viable and active part of our community. And that's where you and other club members and the community at large come in. Over the next year, we'll be challenging you to do your part to assure that the club remains a centerpiece of civic life in Portland. And we'll be looking for your input on what we can do to be making the club relevant in the evolving life of the city. This is early warning, and you're going to hear a lot more from me about this topic over the next year. Well, let's move on to the real reason you're here today, today's program with Jack Ohman. Our board host today is Corleen Kraft. She's the new president-elect of the City Club. She'll ask the first question of our speaker. Following Corleen's questions, we'll open the floor to questions from City Club members. Please keep your questions to 30 seconds. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part through corporate underwriting from Legacy Health Systems, Weyerhaeuser Company Foundation, and Wells Fargo Bank. We're grateful for their support. After my sobering summary of the state of the City Club, we really deserve a more lighthearted perspective. And if anyone can make lighter of the current state of affairs in the world, that person's Jack Ohman, of course. For many of us, Jack Ohman's cartoon in the Oregonian brings us the first smile of the day, so I doubt that much more introduction is needed here. Let me just add that Ohman has been the editorial cartoonist for the Oregonian since 1983, and his columns or his cartoons are syndicated in 300 newspapers around the United States and abroad. He's the author of 8 books, and in between the cartoons, he's studying for his master's degree in history at PSU. So, welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much, Andy, and it's great to be here. The last time I spoke to the City Club, I believe, was 18 years ago, a full generation from where we are today. And I have to say that I have given an unusual amount of thought to what I'm going to say today, or not say, at least an unusual amount for me. In my work, I have to decide by 5 p.m. what I'm going to say. And regardless of the subject, it's expected to be funny. You try being funny about weapons of mass destruction, germ warfare, SARS, and anthrax. One of the downsides I've learned since I became a cartoonist 25 years ago at the University of Minnesota is that I'm constantly expected to be, quote, funny, unquote. Quote, being funny, unquote, is something of a social burden because I am either exceeding or failing to meet everyone's expectations in any given social situation. He's not as funny as I thought he would be. Or, I thought you said he was a cartoonist. They're supposed to be funny. Interestingly, in high school, I was perceived as a serious person, maybe overly serious. You didn't tend to be seen as the funny guy if your hobby in 1974 was Watergate. Dates were always telling me to lighten up when I would rant about Nixon or Ford or speak very earnestly about the dangers of political corruption. They would have much rather discussed why I preferred listening to the Beatles rather than Leonard Skinner. I was a kid out of his time, a boy trapped in the 60s, and not the fun 60s either. The Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK, Khrushchev, black suit 60s that I saw in Life magazine. I'm often asked how I got into cartooning and whether or not I majored in cartooning in college. I have often wondered about that myself, especially at 4:26 p.m., thinking about the USA Patriot Act and have no idea whatsoever. Also, I feel like I don't look like a cartoonist should look. Apparently they wear Birkenstocks with longer, frizzier hair and a beard. Me, I like suits and my hair defies physics. I think I became a cartoonist out of a process of elimination, which is the way most people arrive at careers. For example, when I got my first cartooning job at the Minnesota Daily, I had just been rejected for a bank teller's job. I got the job there, I think, because I was the only one out of 39 art student candidates who knew who William F. Buckley was. I had compulsively caricatured teachers on the margins of my notebooks in high school. Historically, this almost never turns into a lucrative career that leads you to delivering the annual City Club address. I would like to speak to you today about how Oregon has changed for better or for worse since I arrived here. You can invite me back in 2021 for a generational update. Actuarially, I only have 2 of these City Club speeches left in me. I was telling my 15-year-old son, Eric, the other day, who is one of the 3 Oregon natives I have raised in the state since 1988, that I moved to Oregon because of the fly fishing. This is partially true, but I actually moved to Oregon not only because of the grace of former editorial page editor Bob Landauer, but also because Oregon seemed like a cool place to live. And to a certain extent it was. Portland in 1983, if you'll recall, didn't have as many tall buildings. The Pearl was still a place that smelled like beer and railroad cars. There was no obvious cool Hawthorne or Northwest 23rd area. There was no East Bank Esplanade. There was no Schnitz. Frank Ivensee was mayor and Bud Clark was running a bar. Earl Blumenauer was a young county commissioner and Serena Cruz was in junior high school. Mildred Schwab was on the city council, Tom McCall had been dead for a year, and Wayne Morris had been gone less than 9. Senator Hatfield and Senator Packwood were nearly to their chairmanships. Randy Leonard was putting out fires as he is today, again, only they are the ones he accidentally set with his own mouth. Dan Saltzman did not run for anything. Sam Adams and Eric Sten were teenagers. I ran into Eric the other day on the street. And you know you've been in Oregon for a long time when Eric Sten starts talking about encroaching middle age. John Kitzhaber was the guy in the state senate who happened to be a doctor. Will Vinton even owned his own company. And the Blazers were the subject of an adoring book by David Halberstam, not the subject of bookings. The Bhagwan was bigger than Phil Knight. Neil was living on a public sector salary. Tektronix was the largest employer in the state, and there were no Starbucks, no Pioneer Place, no Pioneer Courthouse Square, no Rose Quarter, and no Max, no convention center. It was truly a different world. Today, of course, Portland is different. Oregon is different. Things look different here again. Some of it looks better, and some of it looks worse. How does it look better? In many ways, since I arrived in Oregon in 1983, the state has dramatically improved. Of course, I arrived from Detroit, Michigan, so even Baghdad would have looked dramatically better. I clearly remember getting off the plane from Detroit in Portland at 3 in the morning and seeing roses at the PDX taxi stand. I remember seeing Mount Hood in the morning. I remember seeing the West Hills as the backdrop for the downtown skyline. When I first started at the Oregonian, it too was vastly different in many ways than it is today. We are a successful newspaper with no recent Pulitzers unless you count 1938, but we had a staff of talented people who were ready to grow. And we did. Oregonian reporters smoked actual cigarettes inside the building, and many reporters would have a few drinks at Mary's Spot or the Captain's Corner at lunch. Now they go to 24-hour fitness. We had just gotten computer terminals, and there were dozens of people working in the composing room. Now there are 8. The Oregonian today is one of the most widely respected and successful newspapers in the country, and we also managed to get it into your house without the paper getting wet, most of the time. One of the main challenges I faced when I arrived was how to define my work in the context of being an Oregonian. I became expert at rendering old-growth tree bark and the mossy fuzz that hangs from it, salmon adipose fins, and Douglas fir branches. I learned how to draw Bud Clark's beard correctly, the correct height of Senator Packwood's forehead, the way Mildred Schwab's cigarette dangled, and so on. I have been shunned by Packwood, sworn at by a Democratic U.S. Senate candidate, and Ma Anand Sheila wrote me a letter that started this way. Beloved cartoonist, love, you fascist snake. I have given originals to politicians I thought I had creamed. I felt after a while that I had successfully become not only an Oregonian, but the Oregonian cartoonist. The Oregon I came to was full of people known as Native Oregonians, and they were proud of the label. It was a little off-putting at first. Very rarely in my travels did I hear people proudly assert that they were Native Ohioans or Native Michiganders. With the possible exception of Texas, Oregonians led the way in pride in their state. Being an Oregonian was special, a little like being in Skull and Bones. And we knew clearly what the Oregonian club rules were. We were good stewards of our state. We had clean politics, and we supported our schools. We had a bottle bill thanks to John Passantini. We had a beach law thanks to Jim Redden and Tom McCall. We had a coherent vision of the state thanks to people like Glenn Jackson, Mark Hatfield, Neil Goldschmidt, and yes, sometimes Bob Packwood, Frank and Betty and Barbara Roberts, and maybe some other Robertses I've forgotten, Dave Frohnmeyer, Bud Clark, and many, many other leaders in this state. In short, we had a somewhat bipartisan consensus on many of the things that made this state what it is today. We had good schools and a sense of place. Then things started to look different here yet again. We have gone from that era to a more contentious era, a sadly more cartoonable era. We let other states' political sensibilities seep in. We saw strip malls, gridlock, and political games. Suddenly it seemed like we stopped being our own state and maybe became a little bit more like California's northernmost county. My wife and I have tried to instill in our 3 children a sense of what it means to be an Oregonian. My wife proudly tells people she's an Oregonian as she came here at age 6 months. She's actually a Kansan, born in Fort Leavenworth, and she hates it when I call her a Jayhawk. But she was also the one who talked me into coming out to Oregon in the first place. I had a vague idea of what Oregon was about when I was growing up in Minnesota, Michigan, and Washington, D.C. It was the place with the trees and the mountains. But over the years, this is what being an Oregonian has meant to me. I first came out here in 1981 to give a speech at the University of Oregon. I walked around the campus for a while, and it seemed vaguely familiar. My host informed me it was where they shot Animal House, so I felt immediately at home. It rained the entire time I was here, and I felt that where I lived in Columbus, Ohio was a comparative meteorological paradise. And as a Midwesterner, I also felt that there was a kind of otherworldly quality to Oregon, even though I couldn't see much of it in Eugene because of the mist. I felt like I was in a very remote place, and that was what made it feel special. Now, Oregon doesn't seem so remote. In fact, in the Willamette Valley, there is more in common with the rest of the world where I grew up than not. Now there are traffic jams in Bend, Sherwood has a Starbucks, and the strip malls don't thin out till you get to government camp. That's because Midwesterners like me came out against the admonition of Tom McCall. We came to visit, but we also stayed. And here's my point. It's okay to stay, but it wasn't okay to forget about what Oregon is all about. And I think many of my fellow transplantees have inflicted their sensibilities on Oregon and not let Oregon inflict its sensibilities on them. I know how I am different having lived here. I have fished the Deschutes, I've hiked the gorge, canoed the Willamette, skied Mount Hood, and walked on the beaches. That is enough to change anyone for the better. I have also watched the schools implode, cut my grass in the rain, sat on Highway 26 for hours, tried to find a parking spot on 23rd, listened to Lars, and tried to read the voter's pamphlet. It's all part of living here. I was encouraged to see that Multnomah County and Beaverton declined to go along with the assisted suicide of their schools, and that can give all of us a reason to hope. I know that if we all keep working, keep fighting, and keep moving forward, we can recapture some of the old Oregon and recreate a newer, better Oregon as well. Being an Oregonian to me is kind of like being married. I've been married for over 20 years and a resident of this state for almost that long. There are great days, there are bad days, and there are a few really bad days. There are good decisions, bad decisions, arguments and compromises, successes and failures, frustrations and joys. But despite the ups and downs, I'm an Oregonian, for better, for worse. Because in the end, like all of you, it's the only place that I really want to be. Thank you very much.
Jack, thank you. He was wondering, he asked me as the gifts were being awarded, what he would be able to have, and he really would like to have a mug. Unfortunately, in lieu of that, and with the approval of the rest of the board, I'm wondering, in fact, I'm going to make a decision that you can take home your tent card.
Oh, thanks.
Okay?
I was actually hoping for Patty's present, but
It's a mug of something. A mug. The outgoing executive director has, in her wisdom, said that Jack can have a mug, ladies and gentlemen. So, 2 gifts. I was interested to hear that you are getting your master's degree in history, because one of the things that I liked the best when I was taking American history in college was the editorial cartoons that they showed to illustrate the period and the difficulties that they were having in the period, and I thought that they captured it very succinctly. So a couple of questions for you. First of all, are your cartoons ever censored? And as you're creating them, do you have a sense or a hope that they will end up in a history book someday as a chronicle of what's gone on?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is, am I censored? The answer is not technically. Not in the 1984 Orwellian sense of being censored. Actually, I have way more editorial freedom than I could possibly use at the Oregonian. I know that's difficult for some people to believe. I know a lot of people think the Oregonian is either a communist or fascist conspiracy, depending on what your political outlook is. The fact is, we're also busy putting out the editorial page that we have so little time to censor each other. It's just enough to get it out onto your doorstep every day. So I find that my political philosophy runs in vague confluence with the Oregonians, and so we don't have a lot of trouble that way. But I find that I'm my own worst editor, so I'll get lots of ideas, quite frankly, that are way funnier than the ideas that you would see in the paper, and so therefore they don't run in the paper, and they could possibly be circulation builders, and you know. The answer to the question, the second part of the question is, which was, do I want to see my work in history books? I find it enormously depressing to see my work in history books, although I do, and the fact is that it just means that you're getting older. So, but in fact, my own son, who goes to Sunset High School, they use my cartoons in high schools and junior highs as teaching aids all the time. So that really made me feel incredibly aged, you know. So, no, I don't aspire to that at all. So.
Now we'll take questions from the audience. Please come up to the microphone.
Hi.
Dos
Hi.
Vedonia.
My name is Pavel Goberman. I'm a City Club member and candidate for U.S. Senate. Jack, you mentioned you read...
You need to be wearing my suit, I think.
No, later on, when I will be elected as United States Senator, then I will... My question is to you. You read water pamphlet. It's good. I think if all people of Oregon will read water pamphlet, you will have less jobs, because more politicians will be obey United States Constitution in state constitution. My point is, I asked a request to President and all members of City Club. I have here Bill of Rights, United States Constitution, Code of Ethics. Many members of the legislature violate United States Constitution. So many people don't trust politicians. They say corrupted.
Hey, Pavel, could I get you to one
Let's
question?
do investigate, organized committee, investigate crime of legislature.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jack. Heather Komet, City Club member. In the past year, we saw an awful lot of people comment on how we can elicit some change in a positive way in this state. And yet, Doonesbury came in 2 very short weeks, effectively did everything that people have been ranting and raving about for a period of months. What is it about cartooning that seems to elicit such a stronger response than the traditional stump speech that you might otherwise get from a politician, let's say?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reasons that happens. I think in my own case, I've been hammering on education for years in Oregon, and I hadn't quite turned the tide as quickly as Gary Trudeau had, unfortunately. But I think what happens with the political cartoon is that there's such a crystallized message, and we have a political system where it's very difficult to get anybody to take a position, let alone come to it in an extremely pointed way. So in that regard, I think that political cartoons are tremendously effective. But I also think that in the case of Gary Trudeau, I think my view is the first week really helped and the second week really hurt, in the sense that the first week raised the issue nationally. Hey, they've got to cut school days in Portland. And then the next week was, Oregon schools are terrible and all the kids who are coming out of them are not up to speed with the rest of the country, even Mississippi and Alabama and places like that. So I don't think he was really doing us any favors in the second week. And I think it's going to take a long time to recover with the college admissions officers across the country because of that second week.
Hi, Katie King, City Club member. And not to put you too much on the spot, but I work for the state, and not long ago, the state epidemiologist who was acting director of the CDC came back for a special meeting and gave us the inside scoop on inside the CDC. And I'm thinking it would be very interesting to hear about what it's like inside the Oregonian. And I would like stories, please.
Well, I'm sure it's not as interesting as it is inside the CDC. Well, inside stories at the Oregonian, so many of them I just really don't want to say on public radio today. I mean, any newspaper is a fascinating place to work. There's life and love and war and peace and everything in between. I have to say that it's an exciting place to work. It's an amazing place to see how the news gets presented, because there are I do think that people have a perception about how newspapers really work, which is that, again, it's all some sort of grand conspiracy, when really it's a series of amazing accidents. So I'm not sure I'd really want to get into all the stories that I know about the Oregonian. Just suffice it to say, I'm just trying to get off of the podium here and with my job intact. So I just would say that the Oregonian's a wonderful place to work. Thanks for the question.
Ann Kelly Feeney, City Club member. Jack, I wondered if you could put yourself back in the place of Jack Kennedy, having remembered you doing this some time back, and tell us what you think.
It's just genetics. It's my hair. I can't help it.
And tell us what you think of our current president from Jack Kennedy's perspective.
Well, he's no Jack Kennedy. There's no question about that, to coin a phrase. You want me to compare and contrast George W. Bush with Jack Kennedy? Well, she wants me to do the impression, which I am not going to do. There are reasons why I cannot do that impression at this time, and I really don't want to go into it. But, so, you know, you guys are Irish. Why do I have to do Kennedy for you? What do I think about the current president? Well, I mean, he's an intriguing figure, and I have to say that, again, I'm probably a little less pointed on the podium than I am in the political cartoons, but I find him to be an intriguing figure in that he really does illustrate how almost anyone can become president of the United States, given, and I'm not trying to say that in a snide way, because I think that that's a strength of his, is that he does have an amazing ability to communicate with the regular person, and in the way that Reagan did. As I said, I'm kind of a nostalgic Democrat. I kind of look to Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy and people like that. Thomas Jefferson as my role models, not necessarily George W. Bush. But I think that the process under which he was elected was extremely questionable. I think he's done a good job in solidifying his base within the presidency. I think he owed us no less than that. I think that there was a lot of talk going around after September 11th that centered around, you know, well, thank God he was president, because if Gore were president, this just would have been a total disaster. That's something I completely reject. In fact, I think Gore probably would have reacted far more strongly because he's a Democrat. So I'm supposed to be an objective observer here, so I don't really want to get too far into what I think about him. I guess I would have to say he's pleasantly surprised me as a person. I find him likable in the way that I found Reagan likable. I wouldn't vote for him. I also happen to think that he has the most astonishing political operation in the history of mankind, and that's been a great thing for him. I mean, he really is like Reagan in the sense that he's able to hit his marks. So that's kind of what I think, and all I want to say here. So, yes.
Hi, Jack. Chris Smith, club member. I was struck by your comments about Oregon sensibilities influencing newcomers and incoming sensibilities influencing Oregon. And that made me think of the initiative system, which of course arose out of populist sensibilities in the early part of the century, but I think has been influenced by other political sensibilities since then. And I wonder if you could kind of give us a political cartoon arc of the initiative system in Oregon.
Well, I don't know if my radio listeners would want me to do a cartoon right now. And I don't know how many of you remember William U. Wren enough so that I could actually talk about that. I'll tell you what I think about initiative. I have a theory about this, which is I think the initiative process had gotten out of control to a certain extent, and I think that we all know why and who got it out of control. We need not name names here, but I also think the people need to have an outlet besides the legislature. So what I think they ought to do with the initiative system is keep it intact and do one simple thing, and I call it, if I had $1 million and a signature drive campaign, I would call it Shut the Door. And shut the door is make sure that the legislature cannot refer things back to the people. I think that's the #1 problem with the with the initiative system right now. It just gives the state representatives and senators an out, so they don't have to decide. We have a democratic republic. They should act in that manner. They should be able to act as our representatives, but they also should not be able to opt out of representation when they don't have the political courage to do so.
Good afternoon, Megan Steele, City Club member. I'd like to hear more about the cartoons that you decide shouldn't be printed in the Oregonian. No, just in general, what are your sort of guiding principles and values? When do you think you've gone too far, and when do you think you've hit it just right?
Well, I always say my favorite cartoon is the one that I just finished at 4:59, so it's funny how your guiding principles go right out the window when you have to fill that space at the top of the page. I think that having a guiding principle when you're a political cartoonist is almost oxymoronic in a way, because we're supposed to be kind of operating in a satirical free fire zone. Although I find that as I've gotten older in this profession, I've been doing this for 25 years, that the boundaries have been moved further back and further back in terms of what we can say and not say. I think that having gone through the Monica blue dress era, I think that that's about where the outside of the envelope is now. Imagine having my job and trying to deal with something like that. So I think the guiding principle that I have is to fairly illustrate what's going on while making sure that people will come back the next morning. And that's a very difficult and narrow line to walk. I've often felt that the best kind of political cartoonists would probably have Tourette's syndrome, where they would just say whatever pops into their head, and then people would respond or not respond. So that's the short answer. So thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. Follow-up to this last question, which was part of my question. I did hear you say that the Doonesbury second cartoon did not help. And so I assume that there are some personal ethical judgments or criteria that you do use as you look at other cartoons and their impact on persons or causes. So my question is just to push that a little further and maybe look at the whole arena of journalistic ethics, and my question is whether the editors and cartoonists at the Oregonian have conversations about what the ethical guidelines are in journalism, because it seems to me that some writers...
Boy, do we ever.
Well, how can you help a reader like me understand what those conversations are like as I look at some things that get published and wonder how? Where do you draw the line as a group between poking wonderful fun at individuals or causes or events versus doing real harm to persons or causes in a malicious way?
Well, I'm sure I've never acted in that way that you've described. Well, first of all, we have existing libel laws, which helps us. You have to remember at the Oregonian, and specifically on the editorial page, we have the whole gamut of political opinion running from David Reinhardt to David Saracen and everybody else in between. So I can tell you that some of the board meetings are probably way more entertaining than the editorials. But I think we have a collaborative process. We come out at some sort of rough justice eventually. And we see that, it has a very lapidary effect when you're having all this give and take, and then sometimes feelings get hurt and people stalk out of the room, but at the end we wind up with some sort of judgment. I do think that working with my editor has been a great experience, and because he's somebody who brings out the best in me. We discuss topics every morning, and it's very relaxed. It's far more relaxed than, say, I'm acting right now, where we'll kind of slouch around in chairs for a couple minutes and say, "God, can you believe this?" or "Oh man, I can't believe that." And then, sometimes out of those kind of conversations, I'll get a cartoon idea, or David Saracen will get a column idea, or David Reinhardt will get a column idea, or somebody will get an editorial idea. It's just, I can't tell you. It's like work. You remember that scene in I Love Lucy, where they're working on the production line and they're trying to frost the cakes. That's what it's like working on an editorial page. You're constant. Oh, we've got 4 editorials in the can tomorrow, and we've got to get 3 more by Thursday, and we've got to have 10 by Friday because they've got to carry over the weekend, and it's an amazing process.
Is there a published code of ethics for journalists?
Well, actually, American Society of Newspaper Editors has a code of ethics. The Oregonian has a code of ethics. The question is, how far can you go and be entertaining, not only in my work but in editorials? And you really have to couch what you do sometimes, and because there are a lot of different sensibilities. I mean, the Oregonian and all newspapers are a mass product. They're not a niche product. We're not The Onion. We're not, Sports Illustrated. We've got to appeal to hundreds of thousands of people across the state. And so, whether or not, whether we go too far or not is an individual judgment that we make every day.
Barbara Mahoney, City Club member. What you just said maybe leads to my question. Would you accept the premise that we collectively, not individually, that we get precisely the politicians and the newspapers that we deserve?
Well, I think you get the newspaper you deserve. Whether you get the politicians you deserve or not are two different things. I think in the case of politicians, I think that we've created a system that makes it extremely difficult, particularly in the legislature, to attract the highest quality people we can. I think when you pay somebody $19,000 a year, you can do probably slightly better at Wendy's. You wind up with a multi-tier series of people system of people who are willing to serve. You have the millionaires and people who have jobs that they can kind of continue to do or draw income from during the session. And then you have a group of people who, you know, $19,000 a year seems like pretty good coin, you know. So I have to say that, you know, do we have the politicians we deserve? We keep voting for them, and I think that there are a lot of politicians in Oregon and nationally where it's such a Hobson's choice. I mean, where do you go? I think Portland has an unusually high number of highly skilled and able people. I'm not sure that that's true in a lot of other cities in the United States in which I've lived, but I think that I don't know that we wind up with the government we deserve, but we wind up with the government that we have. Now, I think if in the case of newspapers, we've got, I think the market tells us whether we're doing a good job, and it's a very easy thing to gauge. If somebody canceled their newspaper subscription, and that's a vote. And if 1,000 people cancel their newspaper subscriptions, or 5,000, or 10,000, or 100,000, and this has been going on all over the country for the last 200 years, where people vote with their wallets on newspapers, and that's why I think we have, you know, in New York, there used to be 7 or 8 daily newspapers, and now there are 3, and in Portland there's 1, and in most other major metro areas there's 1. I can't make people read the Oregonian personally. All I can do is do the best cartoon I can do every day. I would say just advertisement for newspapers in general. People always, I often ask people, do you watch television for your main source of news, or do you read the newspaper for your main source of news? And I think more people tell me television, and I say, well, the fact is that if you sit and watch an hour of network news and an hour of local news, if you'd spent 2 hours reading, you know, you could have gone through the Oregonian, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Sports Illustrated, your bowling newsletter, I mean, just everything, and you'd be way better informed. I think newspapers are a great time management tool. They're not, I don't see them as archaic or out or anything like that at all. I think it's still a wonderful thing. I would like to see us living in a more literate society. I would like to see everybody reading more, and I think that we've got a problem with that. And people are sitting around staring numbly at television for hours and hours on end. I mean, how can we have a better democracy when they don't know what's going on? I saw a poll the other day. 65% of the American people can't name one of the Democratic presidential candidates. So imagine how that makes me feel when I'm sitting down every day trying to communicate with the mass audience, where they, well come on, Gephardt, you know, or, okay, there's this guy and he's from Vermont. It begins with a D, okay, sounds like, and so that's a tough environment to work in.
Hi, Chris
Hello.
Allman, City Club member, actually a new one, and it's a joy to be here for a luncheon, to hear you for the first time.
Oh, thank you.
My question
You can
is...
see me at any Beaverton Rotary.
My question for you is, in your 20 years with the Oregonian, can you recall a political cartoon that got the most kind of outcry from either the public or the individual that you may have been lampooning?
Well, my greatest fear is that I will create a great outcry without meaning to, which is, you know, you drew somebody the wrong way, or it was and I'll give you an example. About 15 years ago, I see my friend Larry Hildebrand is here, and I'm sure that he can give me the exact date because he's the expert on city ordinances. Do you remember that there was an ordinance that said musicians could not play their instruments 50 feet within any business area? I think it was something like that. And so I did this cartoon. It was kind of the sliding scale of acceptable musical instruments. And it started off, you know, 50 feet violin, and then 100 yards electric guitar, and then on the top of Mount Hood there would be a guy with an accordion. And so a couple days later, I got a letter from the head of the local Italian anti-defamation group criticizing me for my anti-Italian position on accordions, and, you know, I should be ashamed and stop the hate and the whole bit. So having grown up in Minnesota and Michigan, accordions were really, I didn't think of them as Italian instruments at all. Just thought of them as kind of the normal muzak that I would hear all day. In fact, one of the most prominent state legislators in Minnesota was a guy named Florian Shimilevsky, who had a polka band. Everybody's surprised about Jesse Ventura coming out of Minnesota. I can tell you stories, believe me. But what's the greatest impact my work has had on somebody? I would have to say the biggest response that I've ever had was after the space shuttle blew up, the first space shuttle. Thousands of people sent in checks to buy a copy of this cartoon, and I got a letter from one of the astronaut sisters and things like that. I got a similar response from some of the things that I had done after 9/11. I think what you have is, it's not necessarily what I do, it's more where the audience is, and if they're very emotional and very tuned into a story, they're going to be a more responsive audience. I've also found that where I think I really make my money is not in an environment like that where everybody's kind of talking about Sammy Sosa's bat. I find that when I come down and have to do the 74th cartoon on Alan Greenspan and interest rates is where, that's where I'm the pro. I can take something out of nothing, and that's the hardest part about political cartooning.
Guinevere Milius, City Club member. I have a theory about politics in Oregon and possibly politics nationally. I've heard a lot of waxing nostalgic about Oregonian politicians in general being able to bridge bipartisan gaps in the past. The Packwoods and Hatfields and Roberts and those folks were, according to today's history, able to come together and forge good legislation that Oregon became known for.
It's amazing how quickly Oregonians came together when we had the chairman of the Appropriations and Senate Finance
Yes,
Committees.
of course. But what I'm wondering is, I have a theory that in Oregon and possibly nationally, we're becoming increasingly unable to have civic dialogue that is civil and political debate that is civil. And I wonder if you agree and if you have any ideas about why that might be.
Well, I think that that's true to an extent, but as a kind of a backsliding history major, I can remember that Alexander Hamilton was accused of having a girlfriend in some newspaper in 1783 or something. So this whole atmosphere is not exactly a new thing. And you think about Cleveland and having an illegitimate child, and in fact, I was reading the other day, little-known Oregon fact, Warren G. Harding's illegitimate daughter lives on Mount Hood to this day. She's in her 80s. So, this is not exactly a news story. And she might be great for next year. You might want to think about it. And I understand she draws very well. So, I don't want to overly or put too much gauze over the past, but I have to say 20 years ago, I think it was a slightly better political environment. I think it was a slightly tamer political environment than it is now. I think one of the main things that's really messed up civic discourse is this reliance on name calling. I think it's, even in my cartoons I try not to name call, and I see a lot more of that in Oregon than I used to. That's number one. I think number two, the biggest problem I've seen in Oregon, and I see one of our leading lobbyists in the audience, and he might be able to ratify this. There used to be Republican legislators from Multnomah County, and there used to be Democrats from down in Southern Oregon and out in Eastern Oregon. And I think that these were the guys who were able to kind of bridge the gap a little bit. And now you have totally Democratic Multnomah County, you have totally Republican outstate. How can you possibly bridge that gulf? You can't even agree on schools anymore. How are you going to agree on taxation or all these other issues? And everything's so deeply divided. If I were able to answer that question, I'd run for office myself. I have to say, I think it's an amazing situation to see the country essentially divided 50-50. and something's going to have to give at some point. I do wish that we could. When I grew up in Minnesota, which was actually probably a more conservative state than culturally conservative state than many people believe, we didn't have any trouble agreeing on whether we were going to fund our schools. That was not even up for question. I think that there's so many things that are on the table now that weren't on the table 20 or 30 years ago. That's a problem. That's a huge problem, and I'm not quite sure how you solve that. I think it's just leadership. I think it comes down to, a McCall has to come on the scene. I mean, I really think leadership comes from the hearts and minds of the voters and not necessarily from the mouths of politicians. And I think you saw that a couple weeks ago with people just getting together and say, okay, we're gonna fix our own schools up here. You guys do what you want, but we're gonna take control. And maybe, at some point everybody else is gonna see that too. And then maybe we can forge some sort of working consensus.
Ken Ray, City Club member. I've heard you talk in the past about kind of the evolutionary process you go through in drawing certain public figures that are in office over time, how you learn to draw Clinton's chin a little bit more pronounced, or enlarging Kitzhaber's belt buckle, or whatever kind of the features that you emphasize in some of your cartoons. Who have been some of the hardest public figures for you to portray accurately as you see accurately? And are there any public figures that you've been intimidated by in terms of how you draw them?
Well, I certainly miss Perot. Well, that's a great question. When I came out to Oregon, one of my great fears was that I saw a state that basically functioned politically. You had, very powerful senators who were very smart, able people. We had, a lot of good folks out here, and we still do. But when I look at it from my perspective, just on a purely political cartooning level, I often note that the system tends to present somebody for me every 2 to 4 years, where you can have a field day. When I came out here, it was the Bhagwan. A couple years later, it was Packwood. A couple years after that, it was West Cooley. And then the system taketh away. They resign, or they quit, or they lose the election, or they're indicted and prosecuted and jailed, or they flee to some, third world country, and then I just have to go back to working for a living, and that's frustrating for me. So, how do I? It's hard to turn somebody into a caricature, really. I mean, the trick is to see the subtle things and make them recognizable. Very rarely do you have a Wes Cooley saying that he had served with Sergeant Poppy, and of course there's a Sergeant Poppy, and Sergeant Poppy will verify all this if you just contact Sergeant Poppy, and then of course there's no Sergeant Poppy. You can't make it up. I mean, people always talk about how we live in an era where we're essentially completely immune from satire because all these weird things happen already. I mean, how can you make up a Ross Perot or somebody like that? How I keep my job is just to kind of find the small things and exaggerate them slightly so that maybe people will respond to them that way.
Kurt Wabring, member. Yesterday, the New York Times announced a change in the Guard because one of their reporters was making up stories. And the Times also doesn't have any political cartoons. Do you think the Times lacks a sense of humor?
Not anymore. Yeah, there's a lot more irony at the Times than there was yesterday. Well, the Times does run cartoons on Sunday. They don't have their own staff political cartoonist. I don't know. I think that one of my theories about the New York Times not having a political cartoonist is that the editors are so intimidating that they could never get a cartoonist to take the job because they would just be simply so frightened to go in to talk to a Hal Raines and just, why bother? So I can't really address why or why not the New York Times, doesn't have a cartoon. I mean, but they do run a lot of illustrations and humorous cartoons and that sort of thing. Maybe they need one now. I'm certainly available. Go ahead, Ray.
Ray Polani, a City Club member.
Actually, I'm not available. Did I say that? I didn't mean to say that. Sandy, Fred, if you're out there, I was just kidding. I love my job. I'm not available. Yes. Yes, Ray, I do strongly support mass transit. And I want to do everything I can to strengthen mass transit in this
Thank you
city.
for recognizing
Yes,
me.
you're welcome. We
But
need
it's not
more,
about-
frankly, I think.
It's not really about transportation. Speaking of cartoons, I'm still haunted by Walt Kelly's "We Met the Enemy and It's Us." And I wonder if you want to comment on that, and perhaps also as to, I think one of the problems is too many of us still believe in free lunches somehow or other. We think we can have things and not pay for, or have somebody else pay for them. Do you want to comment?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that a lot of people, particularly younger people, think that freeways and overpasses are naturally occurring events, that they somehow arise geologically out of the ether and spring up, and then, then nature erodes, the holes, and then they repair themselves. So I think that there's a lot, I think that the electorate could do a lot more homework sometimes, but I do think that we do come to some sort of rough consensus many times that works. So, yes.
Carolyn Timmerman, City Club. I've got two questions. One, your opinion of the Willamette Week. And number two, since you have your column in 3 other papers, how can issues in Oregon, do you change that when you send your columns to the other ones? You send Oregon, things about Oregon to New York, or what?
Yes, well, Willamette Week is an excellent publication, and I know many of the people there, and my number one goal in life is to not have Willamette Week write anything about me. And so I'm in the publisher of Willamette Week's book group, and frankly, that's a really good place to be for me. So the other part of the question was what again? Excuse me.
About Oregon issues
Oh.
that you send. Do you send
Oh, well, I
other
do,
columns
yes.
and stuff, like
Yes.
New York? I mean, how can they be interested in something going on in Oregon?
Well, Trudeau was, obviously, but I think the answer to that question is I do 2 local cartoons a week for the Oregonian that I do not send out to my other clients, and then I do 4 national or international cartoons. Yes.
This will have to be our last question.
Okay.
Marcus Samantel, City Club member. Why is it, or how did it happen that Doonesbury is not on the editorial page of the Oregonian?
Well, I don't think it was any political decision. The fact is that we had Doonesbury on the editorial page, I think, for 2 reasons. The first was that they felt that it was so explicitly political that it couldn't be on the comics page, and number 2, it made a venue for people to read the editorial page more. They wanted to put Doonesbury there so more people would go to the editorial page, and so that again, no grand conspiracy. That's just how newspapers work. Another happy accident here at the Oregonian. So anyway, thank you very much for having me.
I'm sure you'll all share with me the hope that we'll continue to see Jack's cartoons in our morning paper for many, many years and give us smiles every morning for a long time. Thank you. The City Club is adjourned.